Let's talk about Night of Cabiria. So, about 10 minutes into this film, I realized that I had seen this film before. In fact, not even 10 minutes in the film, I'd say more like 30 seconds. The opening scene seemed incredibly familiar, and I just was like, well, maybe I'd seen a Federico Fellini film before, and of course, I'd seen lots of his work before, and his work is all just very similar, and they do take place in similar locations, and they have similar themes, so maybe I'm just confusing it with something else. And I kept checking back on IMDb and Letterboxd because due to the amount of films that I have watched, which at this point is up to just over 1,400 movies since 2016, I think, I have to label everything because this is not the first time that I started watching a movie and a couple minutes in realize I've seen it before. Now, usually I log that film, and so I know that I have seen it so that I don't accidentally watch something again. And sure, that doesn't happen with, say, something like a Risky Business or a Citizen Kane or perhaps, The General or these kind of big monumentous films. Not that this film isn't monumentous, but when it comes to the kind of big, very memorable films, of course I'll remember them. But when you watch as many films as I do, when you've seen as many films as I have, it can be hard to keep track of all the films you've seen. And so I've used IMDb, I have used Letterboxd to kind of keep track. And I use both of those services, so just in case I forget to do it on one, it's always on the other. But for this one, it was not rated on either of them. And yet the more I watched this film, the more I realized I had seen it before. And by the end of the film, I knew for a fact that I had seen the film before. I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew exactly what was going to end. Although I don't remember the plot so much because I don't think the plot's that important in a film like this. I remember certain things that they say. I remember certain visuals, and a lot of beautiful visuals at that. I had to face something with myself, which is something I challenged myself with for the whole film, which is I don't watch movies twice. I know there are people who will watch the same movie 10 times over again. I know there are people who have seen Avengers Endgame like 20 times, or they'll go watch A Touch of Evil like 30 times, or there'll be a movie that they watch over and over and over and over again because they're like, oh, it's so good. How can you not want that experience again? And for me, I think a film is only made to be watched once, which I know is a sort of blasphemy in the world of film, but you only get that experience one time. Even though I love films like The Graduate or, say, Buster Keaton's The General or Michelangelo Antonioni's Le Note, I only get the experience the first time. Now, those are all films that I've seen more than once, and the second experience was still a good experience, but it was not as good. And the experience I got watching a second time, I don't think was as good of an experience as watching a new film for the first time. Even a bad film for the first time, I think there's much more to learn from that. Now, perhaps that also has to do with the fact that see watching films as my form of study, much like a scientist reads studies and textbooks. These are my textbooks. This is what I study. I watch films. I see film as a form of studying, as a form of my craft. Just like an artist goes out and studies paintings, I study films. So perhaps that's part of the reason why I can't watch a film more than once. I don't see it as a form of entertainment. I see it as this is my work, this is my schoolwork. I actually cut out a part of my workday for watching a film. Now, of course, part of it's because I have this podcast and all of that. But the other part is even before then, even before I had this podcast, I'd still cut out time to watch a movie every day because this is how you make great films. There's only two ways to make a great film. It's to make films and to watch films. And if I'm not watching films, how am I ever supposed to make great films? And so I've never really wanted to watch a film more than once because that experience is just not as important to me as finding new films. Watching the same film over and over again, I think you miss out on all these other great filmmakers and all these other interesting ideas, and I just don't think it's worth it. So when I realized that I had seen this film, there was a big part of me that didn't want to watch this film, that just wanted to kind of move on and find something else. And of course, part of the problem is I said, oh, I'm going to start watching these Czechoslovakian New Wave films, and I've been getting suggestions from some of you listeners, which is incredibly helpful. And I should watch those, and yet I just got sucked into the foreign language Oscar-winning genres. I was like, oh, this is Federico Fellini, and it looks like I haven't seen it before. And then I start watching it, and I realized that I had seen it, and I still watched the whole thing. Long story short, I watched the whole film because I'd never rated it and I didn't feel like I could give it a good rating. So now I'm doing this in hopes that I can review it in a way so also that I don't watch it a third time. At least if I do watch it a third time, it is by choice and not on accident. And also so I can better understand Federico Fellini because he is a filmmaker that I fell in love with way back when I was first getting into film. So that was, when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, when I knew a lot less about film. I watched Eight and a Half when I was still in high school. And I'm sure if I watched that film today, some, 6 or 7 years difference, I'm sure I would have a very different experience watching that film, having seen so many films since then. And so I challenged myself to watch this film. And the film, of course, has an absolutely amazing actor in it whose name I cannot remember, but she's in a lot of Ingmar Bergman's work. She's, of course, in Federico Fellini's work. She's in pretty much every European film out, right? Every big European filmmaker out there has used her in some capacity. Perhaps even Michelangelo Antonioni, although I wouldn't say that for sure. And the film opens on her having this sort of relationship. They're hugging, they're kissing, they're kind of running in this desolate area, which is the epitome of Italy at this point in time. And what a lot of this film is about is the class divide between the very rich and the very poor, and there's not a lot of in between. There's not really a middle class at this point in Italy. And so they're in this very desolate place and they're hugging and kissing, and the man pushes our protagonist into a river and steals her purse and runs away. And that's the opening scene. The opening scene is her basically drowning, and it's amazing just like the reactions from the people around, because and this feels so very Italian in some way, where someone's drowning, and so then someone goes to someone else and says, "Hey, this person's drowning," and then they have to tell someone else who tells someone else, and there's like 20 people talking about how this person's drowning, but no one's like going in to actually save this person until this group of kids, of all people, not the adults, not the people that should be in charge, but just a bunch of kids who are having a good time, jump in and save this woman's life. And I think that in a certain sense shows the innocence of children. And of course, part of it is just their lack of fear. But I think the other part of it is they're not weighed down by this sort of bureaucracy, by this need to discuss and figure out and talk about, should we save this woman or how should we save this woman? It's not the trolley problem. This woman's actually dying. Let's go save her right now. And these children are the ones who act on it and are the ones who, save her life. And what's interesting is the moment they get her out of the river, the quote unquote men, right, the adults take over and try to push the kids away, which is a bit strange because they didn't want to have anything to do with it until she's basically already saved, until the kids have already done all of the hard work. And sure, they make a big scene of saving her life, but they only do that, it seems to me, to impress the other people of the community. They don't seem to be doing it to actually do anything about it, just like the man and woman who come by on their bikes or just walking by and ask about it, and they make this big deal about saving her life and how they're doing all these things to help her, and yet when she was actually in the water, sure, they were doing a lot of talking and a lot of emoting. And I love how in Italian films everything just right, everything requires your hands. Everyone's talking like this, and it's just a lot of hand gestures. I absolutely love that, and maybe it's because I use a lot of hand gestures, and perhaps, who knows, some far past part of me is Italian, although it certainly makes sense. Although I guess the Latino in me is definitely a hand gesturing people. So I don't know, but I absolutely love that. And they're arguing and they're like, "Oh, we're saving her life," even though the real people who saved her life are the kids, and they don't get any of the credit for. And I think there's something very dark and humorous about a lot of Federico Fellini's work. I mean, you think of Eight and a Half or so many of his other films, which I can't name, which I promise I have seen, even though I cannot name at the moment. His work is often very comedic, but simultaneously very dark and sad. What's interesting is it's often using comedy to hide, right? It feels almost like a facade. It's not like, say, the work of Taika Waititi in a film like Jojo Rabbit, which a lot of people got mad about, as so many people do with, say, To Be or Not to Be, which has a similar idea, although it was written, during World War II, which is the idea of making fun of Hitler, making fun of the Nazis, and people are like, you can't make a joke of that. We need to be serious about it. We need the Steven Spielbergs of the world to be making films about this and to be really serious and grumpy about it. But there's an interesting point that I saw in an interview with this Jewish German director who had lived through the Holocaust, and he was disgusted by the film Spielberg made, and he said you can't dramatize the pain of others, which is exactly what Spielberg was doing. He was dramatizing other people's pain. He was dramatizing this terrible incident. And it's not that these stories shouldn't be told, it's that when you turn it into a drama, it becomes a sort of melodrama. You act like these people's lives are dependent upon how much money you can make out of them. And I know Spielberg wasn't trying to do that, but I think whenever you make a drama of these situations, of very serious situations, far too often it becomes a melodrama and it enriches upon other people's pain. Which, ironically enough, is what they said about films like To Be, To Not To Be or Jojo Rabbit. And yeah, I would argue those are just the opposite, because their comedy comes from recognizing the ridiculousness of the Nazis. And what makes these films so interesting is you talk to historians both back in the 40s and today, and you talk about these films, and they say, no, in a lot of ways, these films are actually really accurate. And that's kind of the point, because when you dramatize the Nazis, when you dramatize these terrible incidents, you give those people power. You give the colonizers or the oppressors, whatever you want to call them, you give them power. You're saying they are powerful and we are weak. But when you make fun of them, then you take away their power. That's how you get rid of their power. You do not get rid of their power by saying you are strong and amazing and you beat us. You say you are ridiculous and stupid and silly, and that's where films like Jojo Rabbit kind of play their comedy. But Federico Fellini doesn't do that, especially in this film. This film isn't sort of showing the ridiculousness of it, but it's actually used as a sort of facade. Often these really serious moments will be followed by kind of ridiculous moments. For instance, there's the moment where our protagonist is in this really wealthy person's house, and you can't help but think of a sort of Citizen Kane style house where it's incredibly opulent and there's just stuff everywhere, and it's clearly the house of someone who has just tons of money. And she gets lost in this house and she runs into a glass door. Now, of course, on one end, it's just showing her naivete and just the difference of worlds that the two live in. And of course, when you think of the glass door, you think of sort of the glass ceiling, but you also think of this idea of a window. You can see their opulence, you know that is there, it feels like you can touch it, and yet when you reach out for help from the wealthy, there's this separation. And it's a very clear separation, you can't move in between. But the humor is also, I don't think it's there to lighten the mood, but I think it's more to hide it almost, to hide the dark tone of it. And I think if you took out the comedy of this film, it would just be way too dark. Because at that moment when she wakes up from drowning, her first thought is just to be like, no, 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 I'm fine, I'm fine, and she just walks away, which is just kind of ridiculous and humorous, and again is using that humor, and she uses the humor particularly to hide from the pain. And I think that's what this film is a lot about. It's about using humor to hide from the pain, although when you think of the end of the film, I think that same humor is used to overcome the pain. But at the beginning of the film, she goes back to the place and she's looking for this guy who just tried to drown her and stole 40,000 lira or whatever, which I would say this is one of the most challenging things about watching old films, especially from Italy, because after World War II, there's this incredible inflation in Italy and Germany and other places. And so, like, how much things cost is kind of confusing. And then you also have to do, like, well, this was also 80 years ago, so the price of things are different. But not only on top of that, it's also a different currency because, even if you watch American films before, you're like, I don't know, is a dollar a lot of money? Is it a little money? It's very confusing. And especially because in movies, right, things cost different than they actually do in the real world. And it's all just very confusing. And so the numbers just seem like random numbers, and you can't really figure out what anything is about. But using your basic contact clues, you figure out that he stole an amount of money that really isn't a lot, but it's not a little either. And there's that incredible joke where she says to her best friend, would you kill someone for 40,000? She says, I'd kill you for 5,000. And it shows their really interesting and unique and strange relationship, because it's a relationship built on friendship, but it's also built off of necessity. They're neighbors. They have the same job, which is they're both prostitutes. And this is something I find really fascinating about this film, and I think something that modern filmmakers often fail to be able to do, and something I aspire to, which is they can talk about very adult topics and yet do it in a way that is very PG. I mean, if you actually look at the rating for this film, it's a PG film, and there are plenty of films that take that sort of same topic that are made today, and those are all R-rated films or NC-17 rated films. And to be able to tell that story without that crassness, even though you never see any sort of nudity, you never really see them talk about sex, you all know what they do, you all know that they are women of the night, and even though it's never outright said, it's very clear that that's what they do, and I think that's really intelligent on the way of Federico Fellini, but it's also something they had to combat at the time because the Catholic Church, although maybe not past this point, but for a very long time, basically ran the movie industry, and so there were certain things you just couldn't talk about. The idea of having two beds in a bedroom wasn't something people actually did. It was just something you saw in movies because there was a way you could get away with a TV rating. It didn't actually happen, although I spent much of my childhood believing that's just how people lived in the 60s, which actually isn't the case. There was never a time where people had two beds in a bedroom, although that does sound like a kind of sort of nice idea on the surface, at least, but that never really happened. It was just this idea that was created by the Catholic Church so they could get past, or I suppose by filmmakers to get past the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was like, well, you can't depict sex. And I think that Federico Fellini's kind of work and so many of the works of so many filmmakers of the 50s and 60s, although of course with the 60s you have the Cultural Revolution and the movement away, especially with say like the French New Wave, which certainly gets into a certain sense of sexuality, certainly more than the work of the past, but there's still some innocence. This is still the 50s before the French New Wave came around, or Italian neorealism really came around, so it's still sort of early in that phase. And you see her relationship with the other sex workers, I guess would be the best way to call it. And you can see that she's a hardworking woman. She saves, she spends her money only on things she likes, and even though at the beginning of the film it seems like she's a fool, she's clearly someone who has this sort of independence and values independence more than anything else. And it seems like part of the reason, even though she's sort of ashamed of her job when she talks to people about it, it's also a source of pride that she is independent. She owns her own house. She tells, right, the rich man that she has all of the modern necessities. She has plumbing, she has water, she has electricity. She owns her own place, and she's very proud of that. And yet there's also the shame of constantly being tricked by these men who take all of her money, which is, I suppose you can see the irony of this. They are men who are paying for love, and then in the end, she ends up, as you see when she is back in the house yelling about Giorgio. She buys him all these things. He's basically, oddly enough, even though she is a prostitute, she is paying for love in the same way they had been paying her for love, because she's up to this point always seen love as transactional. And when you see the relationship with Oscar later on, you can see that she sees that relationship as transactional. And when she discusses about the other sex workers, they say, oh, what does he want, right? What's the long game here? What is he asking for? And she says she doesn't want anything, because all they see is transactions. And it's blowing her own mind that love can be anything other than transactional. That can be more than just money or kisses. Of course, we go back to the film we talked about yesterday, Something Different. And the idea of what will I get in, right? If you give me a kiss, what will I get in return? It's the same sort of transactionalness. And perhaps that comes with the territory of being a lady of the night. But with Oscar, it's the first relationship that isn't transactional. And even earlier on with the relationship with the wealthy man, which she kind of fumbles into because she's not able to work in her normal area because they're being kind of mean, and she just fumbles upon this rich man who just broke up with his girlfriend, partner. It's not really clear what she is to him, and she runs into them, and they kind of have this night where they go to a club and they dance, and she's very proud of the fact that she's with someone like him. She's very proud of the fact that she's kind of won. You can see, like, when she walks around, she has this sort of sense of winning. When she first walks into the club, and there's this ridiculous scene where she can't get past the curtain, and she keeps fighting, and it's clear that she doesn't fit in the traditional sense, and yet she doesn't care about that. She's proud of that. She knows that she doesn't fit into your typical rich person, yet she doesn't want to be that sort of, even though part of her, yes, wants independence, wants wealth, she doesn't want to be these women who just sit around and do nothing. She feels like, in a certain sense, she has more independence than them. And you see that when she dances, he asks her to dance at this club. And all the other women who are dancing or sitting down, they are very reserved, very feminine, right? Very, very woman like, quote unquote. And yet her, she expresses herself, she does what she wants, she does the mambo and has fun doing it and feels independent, and in that way she has a certain independence that these other women never will, because she's not bogged down by the expectations of wealth, of society, of culture. She can do what she wants, and in that way she has a certain freedom that they don't. And then her and the rich man go back to the room, and there's no, at any point, sort of suggestion that the two will have sex. And it's funny that when she's in the room with him, she asks him for a picture so she can show her friends and prove to him that, again, that she was there, some sort of, right, proof, a transaction like before. And of course this is, I suppose, a sort of transaction because she is a woman of the night, and he basically picked her up. Although if he realized that, I guess he does, because later on he gives her money, but it's unclear. But I think it's interesting that what this I believe he's an actor once, isn't really sex. It seems like what he really wants is just companionship. He just wants someone to be around, and that's really what he's paying for. He sees not only love as, actually, it's not even that he sees love as transactional. He doesn't see sex as transactional. He sees companionship and friendship as transactional. Of course, later on, the woman comes and he ends up having sex with her and hiding, ironically enough, the prostitute, or the sex worker, I should say, in the bathroom. And it's clear to me that when you have this much money, when you are this successful, for him at least, sex isn't something he's really interested in. Love isn't really something he's interested. He's really more interested in a platonic relationship. He's more interested in having friends. And yes, for him, having sex and having love, quote unquote, is free. It's easy. The thing that's hard for him is finding friends. The moment he meets, quote unquote, his friends, as the sex worker says, our protagonist says, you can see that he kind of squirms away from it, because when he meets them, the first thing they talk about is film. The first, and not only film, but how he can get them in, the transactionalness of their friendship. And to him, he's always seen friendship, because he is successful, as so many successful people, I assume, are. I don't actually know, I've never been successful, but they fear this sort of friendship because they fear people only want friendship so they can get things. And so he pays for friendship just like the way the other people in the film pay for love, pay for sex, because those things to him are easy, but friendship, real companionship, someone who genuinely cares about him, is hard to find. And it seems like she does actually care about him, and I think it helps, and I think it allows him to move back into that relationship with the woman. And I don't know if, I mean, he's certainly not a good person, but you can understand where he's coming from, and you can empathize with him and sympathize with him. And yes, he doesn't really treat his partner, girlfriend, person perhaps greatly, but you can understand that what he's searching for is something that he can't find in her, which is companionship, friendship, love. And so at the end, he pays her off, and she's like, no, I don't want the money. It was just great to meet you. And yet he insists on paying her, which shows that he cannot move past the idea of, if a friendship is to really exist, it must be transactional. There is no other way this will work. And yet she's saying that she genuinely enjoyed being with him, just being there, eating great food and having a good time. And yet to him, it's still transaction, and she is forced to take the money, showing that he sort of failed in his pursuit of a non-transactional friendship. And so she goes on and she's wandering around, and she goes to this show, which is like a hypnotist show, which you don't really see anymore because I guess we're over hypnotizing, but it was a big thing. You watch any film from the 60s, basically every film had a hypnotist scene, and most of the time they're sort of making fun of it, but there's a certain reality to it. Also, there's a certain buy-in that I suppose you just really wouldn't get today. And they hypnotize these men, and it's fun, and then they hypnotize her, and you see her vulnerable. You see her say that when she was 18, she wanted to fall in love, and all that she's really wanted her whole life is just someone to care about. She wants love, she wants sex, she wants a real relationship that isn't based in transaction. And then right after that scene, we meet Oscar, quote unquote. And I put that in quotes because it seems to me that his name was never really Oscar. He was always playing this long game for the very first minute he met her, and the proof of that is that he says his name is Oscar. Now, when she first meets him, of course, she is a bit skeptical. She's like, I don't know who you are, blah, blah, blah. You're at the show, you laughed at me. And he slowly but surely convinces her that he really loves her. And it seems to the audience also that this is a genuine person who really is in love with her. And the fact that his name's Oscar is something we as an audience just buy into. Now, of course, I suppose if this relationship ended up going well, perhaps we'd have questions of is naming him Oscar a little too on the nose? But when we see where the relationship goes, we say, oh, that makes a lot more sense. Because for those who have seen the film, which if you haven't seen the film, I'm not really sure why you would listen to these reviews, because they can't possibly make any sort of sense if you haven't seen the film. But he convinces her basically to get rid of absolutely everything, to sell her house, to take all of her money out of the bank, to sell everything she owns. And you can see her best friend with her like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing any sort of things? And she's like, I'm in love with this guy. And it's also at that moment that you see that their friendship between Vanda, or Wanda in America, as we would say, and our protagonist is a very sincere one and a true one. And that even though, yes, their friendship was built out of necessity, these are people who really care about each other. And it's a sort of tragedy that our protagonist fails to see it at this moment, but that's where the true love is. The true love isn't with this man that she met 2 weeks ago and then suddenly proposed to her, which is really quick. And he points out and says, well, I don't really care about your past or any of that. I know your inner self, which is a little ironic because how can you know someone's inner self if you don't even know someone's outer self? How can you know someone's inner self when you don't really know them at all? Which is something she sort of challenges him with, and they just kind of move past it. He convinces her because she's so inept at true love, because she wants true love so badly, she's willing to overlook the many sketchy things about him. And so she sells all of her stuff, and she sells her house to this family, which there's like 10 of them, and it's this tiny little house. And again, it comes up against this, the poverty versus wealth, and also how you climb up the social class isn't by hard work or by work of any kind, but it's merely by lucking your way into it, just like she lucks her way into it. And so she goes off with him, and they're having dinner. And at this point, they're not yet married, but they're as close as they are. And she's carrying like 400,000 plus lira in her purse, which, I mean, it's a giant bundle of money. It seems like a lot of money. Again, I don't know how much money is. I assume it's enough money to buy that little house that she has and all the money she has in the bank. So it's some sort of amount of money, and a good amount of money at least. And you can see for the first time that he's acting a little bit strange. He's acting a little bit odd. He's not acting like his normal self. He seems sort of out of it, sort of unfocused. And there's the beautiful mountains in the background, and it's juxtaposed by this stilted scene. There's the beauty of their surroundings, unlike most of the film, where most of the film is the surroundings are sort of desolate and gross, and yet the relationship is where the love is, it's where the beauty is. And yet, much like I suppose earlier with the facade of the wealthy man, and even though he has everything, even though everything looks beautiful, he lives a very miserable life. In this same sense, even though everything looks beautiful, it's the first time between a relationship that feels stilted, it feels wrong. And you can see as she shows all of her money, kind of this gleam in his eyes. Maybe that's reading into something, knowing what happens next. But it certainly feels like it's there. And then they go off into the forest, and it feels off. And I don't even know how Federico Fellini does this, and this just shows the mastery of Federico Fellini as a filmmaker. Is you can tell something's not working. I don't know if it's the score, I don't know if it's the camera movements, I don't know if it's the acting, I don't know if it's the lighting, I don't know what it is, but something just feels wrong. And the way it just holds on him for long periods of time, and the editing's a little strange and slow, and I can't remember if there's a score or not, but if it is, it's very quiet and it just feels wrong. And then he says he wants to see the sunset. And at that point, you can just tell that something's up. You're not really sure what it is, but you can tell something's up. And they go to see the sunset, and they're at this giant cliff. At that moment, I think as the viewer, just know what's going to happen. You can see the bookend that was the beginning of the film. There's a reason that the film starts with her being pushed into a river. It's happening here again, and that's sort of a brilliant sort of foreshadowing that ingrates itself into the viewer's mind, even though perhaps they didn't realize that first scene was so important. This is why it's important. It's not really important that the person stole money. It's not really important. It's not really an inciting incident in the traditional sense. It's important because it puts a lot of extra pressure on this scene, especially because, unlike that first person, we did not know that first viewer, so we didn't really understand why. And it was more comedic, as this film starts out much more comedic and descends, I should say, into a sadder and darker film. In the same way, it's partly comedic because we don't know who this guy is. He just seems like a bad person. Like from our perspective, he's clearly a bad person. And yet, much like she was tricked before, the viewer is tricked into liking this man. And when he betrays her at that moment, when she realizes that he wants to kill her, she's over it. She says, "Kill me, please kill me. I don't want to live anymore." And it's one of the darkest moments. And I don't think it's dark because he takes her money. I don't think it's dark because he wants to kill her. I think it's dark because she doesn't think she can do this anymore. She finally found what she believed to be love, and she lost it just like the first time. And now the viewer has gone through the same experience that she went through with Giorgio. And now we feel tricked and betrayed. And he doesn't end up killing her, and there's a sort of cowardness in that because he can't even, right? He doesn't even have the gumption to kill her. He doesn't even the gumption to go through with it. Where at least the first guy sort of tried. I mean, he failed, but at least he tried. And then he runs off. And then we have the final scene where she is walking out of the woods and onto the street, and there's this sort of festival going on. And this kind of gets in back to something that goes into a lot of Italian filmmakers' work and perhaps a few French filmmakers too, although this seems very Italian, which is they always are kind of obsessed with religion and especially Christianity. And in so many of these films, even in this film, which I didn't even get into, there's a lot of scenes where they go to these sort of Christian festivals and go to like these moments where they say confession or they ask forgiveness from whoever. And it just seeps itself into the film in a way that feels like it's just part of who they are. And when they don't have that, which none of these women of the night seem to be very religious because, well, they're forced to be women of the night, so they don't really have the option to be religious. Just that, as one of the sex workers points out, of course he can be religious. He has the privilege to be religious. He's profit off of pimping women and selling coke. Of course, he can beg for forgiveness. But what do we get in return? The people who are poor, the people who are actually suffering. How has God helped us? How has Jesus Christ, the Lord and Savior, helped us? And at the end of the film, there's another of these festivals, much like you've seen. I don't know if they're really festivals, but you see men and women and children walking down with big crosses, and sometimes it's friars, and sometimes it's monks, and it's these different people walking down asking for alms. And at the end, there's this sort of festival, and she is in the midst of it. And you see her crying, and what's interesting is the last scene isn't a scene of sadness or desperation, but there's a certain happiness that you see her smile almost at the end, and there's this wonderful music, very upbeat music playing behind it, which another interesting thing about the score is so often the score is so upbeat even though there's these kind of dark and cruel things going on. And I think what that smile is suggesting is that does exist, and I think what she's realizing at that moment is that her real love isn't, I would say, if you were to put this in a romantic comedy, which I think you could argue this is a romantic comedy in a certain sense, the love isn't between her and Oscar or her and the rich actor. The real love is between her and Vonda. And I think at the end of the film, the reason she's smiling is because she's going back home. She's going back to where she belongs, which means she's also going back to Vonda. She's going back to that friendship, the only relationship she ever had that wasn't transactional. At the beginning of the film, she says, "What have you ever done for me?" And that's just it. They haven't done anything for each other. It's not transactional. It's just a relationship built off the love and care for each other. And so out of 10, I would probably give this film a 9 out of 10. I don't know what I gave it the first time around, probably an 8 out of 10. But this film is just incredible. And the more I talk about it, the more I see that there is to it. And yes, it's not a perfect film by any means. I don't know if like my life is changed from this film, which is I know pretty high bar to set, but if my life isn't changed, it's not a 10 out of 10. But there's no real flaws that I can talk about. It's a beautiful film. The editing's incredible. The acting is just magnificent. The story is incredible. There's not a single minute that doesn't feel like it's necessary. It's a great film. It's just, for me, it's just not perfect. But still a 9 out of 10.